Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to talk about this ongoing debate regarding Neanderthals and what's come to be known as the Neanderthal Wars, which is basically, in a nutshell, this large debate about the capabilities and some of the re-examination of the initial assumptions that the researchers and anthropologists, archaeologists, everybody involved when they first discovered the Neanderthals, these knuckle dragging, low expectations of their abilities types of assumptions, and versus the other side, which is the new evidence coming out that supports the contrary, that they were probably capable of a bunch of different things. Very recently, I did an episode about their capabilities in regards to expression and abstract thought, and even their usage of certain tools and capturing golden eagles, which is a very imposing animal, and all of these things. So Smithsonian came out with this article called What Do We Really Know About Neanderthals? And it centers around this scientist studying in Spain, and I think he's Portuguese. He's Portuguese, but he's looking at this one specific cave called the Cueva de Ardales, which is in southern Spain. I have it right here. So if you look at this map here, it's right close to the Strait of Gibraltar, and along this region here, there are a lot of caves, a lot of rocky terrain, and around this area is where they found some cave art and other things that have to do with Neanderthals. And this is where the article centers around. And if you want a Google Earth image here, this is the city itself, and then the cave is a hike. It's kind of far from the city proper, and then it's in this mountainous region here. And here's a inside mapping of what it looked. I think this is one sector of the cave. It's kind of a massive network as far as caves go. So again, this article centers around the revolutionary discoveries in archaeology that show, quote, the species long maligned as knuckle-dragging brutes deserve a new place in human history. So this is what's known as the Neanderthal Wars. And I know everybody has their own opinion. Everybody kind of picks sides. But really, if after reading this entire article and following the debate and all the discoveries, it seems like people should just withhold judgment because of all these either dating techniques, which we'll get into in a little bit later, called uranium thorium dating, which is an improvement upon radiocarbon dating because it could reliably date further back in history. But also all these other discoveries in regards to Neanderthals, and even Denisovans as well play a part in this, because there are also not only are Denisovans and Neanderthals closely related, but there are a lot of discoveries coming out in their right as well, in Siberia and Tibet and so on, in China. So it's better to just withhold judgment and then if you're going to have an opinion, or if you're going to put forth an opinion, just read what's out there and then see what makes sense to you, instead of immediately picking a side. And that seems to carry on or carry over into a bunch of different other subjects that aren't even related to archaeology. It just seems like political football in a sense. So anyway, the Cueva de Ardales is one of the 3 sites in Spain examined by João Zilao. He's a Portuguese scientist who this of which this article is based on, and he's one of those dig in the trenches, what would you call it, on the job training type of guys. Like he is educated, but a lot of his opinions come from his direct experience with working at the sites themselves, and he has, over a long period of time, he's developed a sense of what he thinks are the capabilities of Neanderthals, what they were doing, and even what they were trying to say. So the cave itself houses distinctively splotchy handiwork, vivid patterns, spheres, ladders, or hand stencils. There's a picture of it somewhere. I thought I had it. Well, I'll show you guys a picture of it later. But this is him right here working on one of the caves. And what they're doing is they're taking samples of calcite formation that overlay the traces of the ochre or whatever it is that they painted with. And it usually comes out, it looks like orange or dark orange or a faded red color. And they take whatever forms on top of that, and then they examine it, and they come to conclusions from that. And we'll get into that in a second. So they take these flecks, he sends them to the lab in Germany, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and then they come up with a minimum age. And one of the ages that they came to, using uranium thorium dating, which is pretty new in paleoanthropology, is 64,800 years ago, which is a more accurate redating of what it was earlier, which was about 40,000 years. And they thought, because it was 40,000 years old, this is the old date, that it was done by Homo sapiens. Well, this, now that it's older, they're starting, or Zilao anyway, and his colleagues are thinking that, and it's not just Zilao, by the way, it's a bunch of other guys too. A large part of the academic community think that, or at the very least, they have to rethink that it may have been Neanderthals that were responsible for these cave paintings. And it's very interesting how the goalposts get moved throughout this discussion. But anyway, so they use this more cutting edge technology, and then they found that the analysis showed the markings had been composed no fewer than 64,800 years ago, which might be even older. And the implication obviously is the world's first artists must have been Neanderthals, who were allegedly supposed to be stocky, stooped, preternaturally low-browed, and they became extinct because the sapiens purportedly took the earth from them. I mean, that's one of the that was one of the and still is one of the beliefs out there. And Zilao says himself, more than a dozen of the paintings have turned out to be the oldest known art in Europe, and with current knowledge, the oldest in the world. And this idea of the Neanderthals being the old masters, the originators of art and all that, maybe they aren't the first, maybe there's someone before them, but if these dates are true, then they at the very least predated us. So you would have to assume, or you wouldn't even have to assume, it wouldn't be a leap of imagination to think, okay, maybe the Neanderthals somehow passed on these techniques to us, sapiens. And you could, part of the reason why that's not such a big jump in imagination is because we have their DNA. We have like 4%. Asians and Europeans on average have about 3 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in us. So, I mean, go figure. If you have that much of a relationship where you have offspring with each other, then who's to say that the sharing of ideas is unheard of? If that's the case, that doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, so ever since they were found in 1856, Neanderthals in Neander Valley in Germany, researchers have argued about the position of this group of early people in the human family tree. And this is part of the Neanderthal Wars I was talking about. They initially thought they thrived in Europe and Western Asia, dating back 400,000 years ago, and right up to 40,000 BC. And from then on, Homo sapiens took over. This is, again, the mainstream, or the initial analysis, the initial narrative, I suppose. Homo neanderthalensis got a bad rap as lame-brained brutes, and that's kind of that dim-witted, amoral archetype or a stigma attached to them has been there ever since, until guys like Zilao came and started digging deeper into the evidence and found that, okay, this stigma is crumbling, let's keep looking. And he's had to fight tooth and nail all along the way. A new body of research has emerged that transform our image of Neanderthals. And these are some of the things that we found so far. They had bigger brains than sapiens, they walked upright and had greater lung capacity, and that was big because they thought they were essentially like gorillas walking on their knuckles, this knuckle tracker thing. But they had, it seems like they had greater capacity across the board, physical strength, brain capacity, and a lot of people will argue that brain capacity means nothing. But if we're talking about humans, I don't know. I think that does count for something. They had bigger brains. I mean, some people think they had bigger brains because they had bigger a bigger physicality that required more nerve endings, and I don't know. I'm not a biologist, so that may be true. But either way, they had bigger brain capacity, and that does count for something. Eurasians were skilled tool makers, big game hunters, lived in large social groups. They built shelters, traded jewelry, wore clothing, ate plants and cooked them. They had recipes. They had a specific technique to harden their spear points by heating bark and heating the whatever it is that their spear points were in that. They had fire, obviously. Neanderthals had complex language. They had some form of spirituality because they buried their dead with great care. All of these things have come out, and still the other side of the war, and if we want to talk about the battle lines here, are sticking to the initial stigma that I talked about regarding Neanderthals. So anyway, and here are some of the I guess propaganda, I don't know what you would call it, but these were how they were expressed in pop culture. So I think that's Fred Flintstone here. And this is like this humanoid gorilla type guy here destroying, kind of like a King Kong type of person, the Neanderthal man. These are all from the 50s, and this kind of embodies the stigma that I was talking about earlier. The real game changer came in 2013. So again, 2013, very, very recent, not even 6 years ago. Or yeah, a little over 6 years ago. When after a decades-long effort to decode ancient DNA, the Max Planck Institute published the entire Neanderthal genome. So publishing the entire genome obviously is a big deal, because you can look at what's there and conceivably come up with a genetic basis for whatever argument you have, as long as the genetics support what you're saying. So for example, if you're trying to say Neanderthals had capacity of abstract thought, you can look into the genome and you could conceivably create an argument along with a bunch of other evidence. You could use that as ammunition for your argument. Same thing on the flip side. If you want to argue that they were dim-witted and they had fewer intellectual capacities as Homo sapiens, you could open up the genome and try to state your case for that. But anyway, but what the genome essentially did for us was it revealed that if you're European or Asian, you have up to 4% of your DNA was Neanderthal, directly from Neanderthals. So what does that mean? That means that we were at the very least in close quarters and sharing space, intimate space with Neanderthals for an extended period of time. Because 4%, thousands of years after the fact, if we want to use the bare minimum date of 40,000 years, then that we must have been mating a lot, because having 4% after 42,000 years is a significant amount of your DNA. So here's the outside of the cave. It looks pretty nondescript right here, and there's even a board outside that probably has information. But yeah, this is one of the sites that they believe Neanderthals were occupying for a certain amount of time. So I mentioned battle lines. The battle lines have been drawn over everything from the shape of the nose, depth of the trachea, extent to which they interbred with us. And these are all, in my opinion, I think these are arguments that have to happen. Like, we have to negotiate this thing out and separate the wheat from the chaff and see what's true. But if you're trying to hang your hat on one of these arguments solely to prove that Neanderthals were just dumb apes that were just a stepping stone to us, then I don't think you'd have much of a case there. And I see that a lot. And I think the article will go into that in a second. The latest rumpus centers on whether the abstract patterns qualify as symbolic expression is a $64,000 question. So that's what is being argued right now. These cave paintings, are they even symbolic expression, or are they just random, haphazard, throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks type of unsophisticated type of artwork? That's what's being argued here. The emergence, this is Dirk Hoffman, he's a geochemist, and he's the author of the cave art study. He says the emergence of symbolic material culture represents a fundamental threshold in the evolution of humankind. It is one of the main pillars of what makes us human. And that makes sense, because any type of symbolic culture or anything symbolic that you draw or put on a cave or whatever that becomes permanent, that by default marks some type of expression. So no matter what, it doesn't have to be Mona Lisa or anything like that. It just has to be a representation of some kind of abstract. And that right there is leaps and bounds above any other animal besides humans. And that's what Dirk Hoffman is trying to hit home with that quote, in my estimation. Zalal says it confronts the issue of how special we as modern humans actually are, how distinct we are or are not from humans who are not quite us. And that's another interpretation that is being the kind word is negotiated, but really argued about the past, I don't know, 6 or whatever, even more than that, probably 80 years or so, or whenever the first evidence started to come out that dispelled this brute stigma of the Neanderthals. The mainstream narrative of our origins has been fairly straightforward. The exodus of modern humans from Africa was depicted like it was a biblical event. Chosen ones replacing debased Europeans, the Neanderthals. This is what Zalal is laying out about the mainstream narrative, and he thinks it's all BS, and it's not sophisticated enough, it's not nuanced enough, and really it's a lot more complicated than just human beings, or Homo sapiens were the chosen ones, and Europeans are just old money or old technology or whatever you want to assume. They're just not updated like us. We know better, and we just replace them, and that's it. And Zalal is, according to Zalal, he says that's all BS, and I'd have to agree with him at the very least, just because of everything that's come out. Even the genome, I mean, we have 4% of their DNA. That means something. If they're so stupid, why do we have their DNA then? Like, obviously we are inexorably linked together physically, and it's very clear to me that our history together goes back many millennia. So I think he has a case here. So this is a really long article, by the way. I'll have the link in the description, and it's a really good read, just to help you, if you're a layman, just to help you understand what the landscape is in terms of the perception of Neanderthals and their abilities. So adaptation is the key to Zalal's take on Neanderthals. He has long maintained that they were the mental equals of sapiens and sophisticated enough to innovate, imagine, yada yada. And they incorporated that knowledge into their own culture. And I think just going by my last video of taming birds, that is definitely demonstrated there. I mean, if you have to have some sort of culture to even have a tradition, any tradition, but a tradition of trapping eagles and plucking their feathers for decorative and whatever funerary religious reasons, you have a culture on your hands, no doubt about that. Neanderthals were humans, and in terms of basic things that make us different, there was no difference. So the only difference was that they came before us, is basically Zalal's take. So here's another view of the landscape near Ardalis. It's very beautiful. I think that's the city here, and then the cave is to the left over here. On one hand, Zalal is a cogent voice of reason. No. We got to keep going. Here's another view of the excavation site. Gorgeous stuff, and it's huge. just as a shelter alone, it seems like an ideal place to live if you're a cave person. The upper Paleolithic tools and pendants discovered with the Neanderthal oddments have been found deeper at the site than a deposit with the earliest signs of modern humans. So what that means is, in that cave, there are a certain amount of things. They went a certain amount of depth, and within that depth, they found things that were attributed to modern humans. Well, Zilao and his team went deeper than that deposit, and they found even more stuff. So usually in geology, the deeper you go, the older things are. That's typically what it is. So right away, at the very least, they've found things older than what was already established. Elsewhere in France, the same types of tools and ornaments were likewise found to predate the earliest evidence for sapiens. This pattern implied that the Neanderthal layer had formed before moderns had even reached France. So he's saying that all of this stuff was established before sapiens even came into the picture. So the question is, where did the sapiens come from? And what was their genetic makeup before they met with the Neanderthals? And again, that's another thing that hasn't been clearly defined. Hublin's team argued that the bling was created by Neanderthals who must have come into contact with sapiens and were influenced by or traded with them. So then the mainstream narrative is flipped. Neanderthals came to the modern humans who were already at the cave, and then they traded and whatever. But I think there's not a fallacy, but I think that's if you were to propose that, it seems like there's a discontinuity there, because weren't they supposed to be dumb and not have any concept of the abstract? So why would they trade? Like, if they're smart enough to trade, then what else are they smart enough to do? It just seems like an inconsistency there. So Zilao did not agree with that. Views of the Neanderthals as somehow cognitively handicapped were inconsistent with the empirical evidence. It seems obvious to us that Neanderthals had created these things, and that therefore archaeologists should revise their thinking and their current models. And that's basically what they're asking. Or Zilao and people on that side are saying, hey, there's all this evidence. You should revise what you're thinking instead of just trying to explain away the evidence, and revise your models. And because that's what a model is. A model is a working, intellectual concept, an abstract concept that attempts to explain a certain thing. But models are there because they're imperfect. They're there to be built on, or even entirely scrapped, and a bigger and better and more comprehensive model should take its place. And that's how scientific inquiry should work, and a lot of people would agree with that, but that's not what's happening. It's very similar to what's going on in Egypt regarding the Sphinx and the pyramids. Egyptologists are very, very, they're very protective of what they've established, their model of Egyptian history, and they stick to it and they defend it to the death. And that is complete inversion of what a scientific model should be. So if you really want to go deep in the Neanderthal Wars, that in and of itself, what I just talked about in terms of intellectual defensiveness and building these walls around this working model that's not even true and can be clearly built upon, they're just trying to save their dilapidated fortress. And that, to me, is what boils down the Neanderthal Wars. That, when you boil it down, just like any other, especially with Egypt, like I mentioned earlier, it just seems like the old guard are just not willing to give an inch. And it doesn't matter, because in the end, truth prevails, just like light. Like, darkness can't block light out. You need to have something to block light out, but even light will find its way. So to me, light is the ultimate metaphor for truth. Anyway, after just a day's look at the evidence, we realized that neither scavenger nor imitation worked. You cannot imitate something that does not exist. And then the article goes on. It's a really long article, guys. You should go read it. This was the first, the first rendition, the first sculpture of a Neanderthal back in, I think, like the 20s, even before the 1920s. Anyway, it's a lot different now, what we have now, but this kind of took off and kind of reinforced the meme of Neanderthals being this dummy Fred Flintstone type guy. Many prominent figures in the field are prominent only in the sense that they are high priests of a new cult, the Church of the Dumb Neanderthal. And yeah, that's basically, that's Zalau's take. This is the Church of the Dumb Neanderthal, and you're either with us or you're not, and forget about all that evidence. And that's basically what's going on here. So anyway, the article toward the end talks about a bunch of different other cases, like a human mandible in the Carpathian Mountains, remains of a 4-year-old child who had been buried in the sediment for nearly 30,000 years, and who had Neanderthal and sapien qualities. So again, all of these discoveries kind of back what Zalau was saying. Look, there's a generation of people 30,000, 40,000 years ago who had clearly Neanderthal and sapien qualities, and they were having children and who were viable children. So you can't tell me that Neanderthals and sapiens had absolutely nothing in common. It does seem like they were two different peoples who united in some way, whether it's surface interactions like trading or whatever, or even living in communities together. And the same thing was said about Neanderthals and Denisovans. They think that they were, at the very least, they were meeting up in close enough quarters and for a long enough period to have child rearing going on. So again, think about that. What requires that trust? What requires to build that trust and comfort to do that? And it doesn't seem like it was rape either, because there's no sign of like war or like people being murdered or anything back then in that way. It seems like that was more recent with Homo sapiens. So yeah, just let me know what you guys think about this. There's all kinds of dating about Neanderthals using mollusk shells in a decorative and symbolic way. Again, this is 115,000 years ago. So if they're stupid, why would they do that? Just one more thing before we end. This is uranium, thorium dating. So the amount of uranium in calcite declines as it decays into thorium, and the ratio of those radioactive isotopes is like a clock that starts ticking the moment the crust forms. So the higher the ratio of thorium to uranium, the older the calcite. So it's literally like a clock. Radiocarbon dating is very similar, except it's unreliable beyond 40,000 years, and it's restricted to organic material. So because of that, it's not radiocarbon dating is not great for dating stuff like Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and like ancient humans, just because you have kind of like a hard cap of 40,000 years before the dating is unreliable. So it does make sense now. A lot of stuff about Homo sapiens is dated around 40,000 years, and it's just, well, we have to re-examine that because the technique might be off, and there are a lot of detractors who say, yeah, radiocarbon dating is not reliable when you want to go even further back in history. So let me know what you guys think about this article. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm sure the comments will be very interesting as well. And that about does it. That's the Neanderthal Wars.